Welcome to the Beginner's Garden Podcast and welcome to February. But as much as I love leaving January in our rearview mirror, February is a complicated month for the gardening community, especially in the US. For some of you, you are weeks away from snowmelt and planting, while for me and for others, February is when a lot of prep and some planting starts to happen. To use a baseball analogy, some of us are already on the field taking batting practice. Others are in the dugout getting our gloves, and others are still in the parking lot waiting for the stadium doors to open. Regardless of where you are in your gardening season, today I'll be sharing with you 7 garden tasks many of us can be doing in February. While some of us will be doing them all, like me, if you can't, you'll have a head start in knowing what's to come soon. To go back to the baseball analogy, regardless of where we are now, we're all going to be playing the game soon. By the way, before we get into those tasks, if you're new here, I want to take a moment to welcome you to the Beginner's Garden Podcast. I am Jill, and I am so glad you're here. Regardless of whether your garden space is big or small, if you want to grow your own delicious vegetables, herbs, or even fruit, you are in the right place. Now, also before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsor for today's episode, Organic Rev. You may have heard of Organic Rev. It's an organic plant growth stimulant that you can use year-round, but right now you may be most interested in its benefits for indoor seed starting. All you have to do is mix 1 ounce of Organic Rev with 1 gallon of water and apply directly to the seed starting trays or pots, or you can moisten your potting mix with the mixture like I do. To get more information and to get a discount code for Organic Rev, you can go to organicrev.com and use my promo code JILL10 to get 10% off. Let's get into 7 tasks that you may be able to start doing in February, and if not, you'll be doing fairly soon. And number 1 is bed and soil prep. This is really important because we want to make sure that our beds are ready for us to plant whenever nature is ready for our plants and when our plants are ready for the garden. If you have an in-ground space or you have raised beds, but probably more likely if you have an in-ground space, you may want to consider having your soil tested, especially if you've never tested your soil. And that's so that you'll know what the pH of the soil is, which is a huge factor on whether your plants are going to be able to uptake the nutrients that are in the soil. But you may also want to know if your soil needs additional nutrients. Of course, compost is always a great choice. That's pretty much what I do in all of my ground and my raised beds anyway. But if you have a specific nutrient deficiency, then a soil test is going to be able to tell you that. And it will also be able to tell you what you need to do to correct it. Another reason I recommend a soil test is because sometimes we want to just throw fertilizers in our soil and just assume it's going to be okay. And I have done that on occasion, and I haven't honestly seen any huge ill effects that I know of, but organic nutrients in particular can be overdone. Well, honestly, synthetic fertilizers can be overdone just as much. But with organic nutrients, we want to be careful not to overdo it because it can upset the chemistry in the soil, which is so important in an organic garden so that the microbes can be able to make those nutrients available for the plants. Now, when you do a soil test, if your pH is out of balance, it will tell you how much lime or how much sulfur you need to apply. So if you have any questions on the condition of your soil, I do recommend a soil test. If you're growing in raised beds like I am, then they might not all be quite ready to go. Some of them may have some winter weeds that have sprouted. This is if you don't have snow all over your raised beds, but you can see that they're not the same as they were in the fall. Whether they have weeds growing or you have plants that were left over from last year, or, and this is probably the case regardless, the raised bed soil has sunk some, then you're going to want to take steps to help refresh that soil. Now, personally, what I do is I will take out any old plants that are still in my garden. At the moment, I have a couple of broccoli stalks I haven't taken out yet, but I'll take those out and put them in the compost. If there are winter weeds that are in the garden, I will either take them out and put them in the compost, or I'll just cover over them if they're more of your winter weeds and not noxious weeds, like not that Bermuda grass is growing in January and February, but if it was something like Bermuda grass, I would take it out. But most of the time, the weeds that we find in our raised beds are not going to be a major problem. And so a lot of times I'll just leave them there and I'll just add soil on top of them. But that's the thing, is that I want to add a fresh layer of compost regardless, because what we want to do with existing raised beds is we want to add new compost so that we continue to nourish the soil, we continue to nourish those microbes, and we set the stage for our plants to be able to have the nutrition that it needs. Now, I have a whole podcast episode on refreshing your raised bed soil and on I have another one on choosing the first raised bed soil to begin with. So we'll put links to those podcast episodes in the show notes, just so you can get some more how-to information on that. But all that to say, you definitely want to consider how you're going to refresh that soil. And if you had good growth last year, for me, I just add compost. I don't worry about fertilizer. Again, if you didn't have good growth last year in your raised beds, then you might consider doing a soil test for that raised bed so you can get an idea of what you might need to do to remedy it. So task number 1 is bed and soil prep, if you can get out into your garden right now. Number 2 is seed starting indoors. Now, obviously this depends on where you're located. You've heard me talk about that a lot already, but some of you will be doing cool weather crops. And this is especially if your last frost date is like mid-April to early May. This may be the time that you want to start seed starting broccoli, kale, lettuce, some of your cool season crops. Of course, double check all of those dates. I do have a free download to help you calculate the dates of when you should plant different things, but I'm just trying to give you a blanket idea of what you might need to plant in February. But many of us can start planting some of our warm season crops, especially in the later part of February, depending on where you're located. For me, a lot of that is going to be tomatoes and peppers are going to start being indoor seed sown in the later part of February. And this is a good timing if your last frost date is in March or early April. Mine's in early April, so I usually start these in the later part of February. But if you have a last frost date in March or you don't have a frost date, then getting them started pretty soon will be one thing you'll want to do here in February. Now, if you started cool weather crops in January like I did, be prepared to start potting them up in February, about 4 weeks, give or take, after you planted the seeds. As of now, I think my broccoli, cauliflower seedlings, cabbage seedlings, they're all about a week or 2 old. And usually they start growing really slow when they're starting to establish roots. But then when they start developing those true leaves, not the first 2 that emerge, but the leaves after that, they really start to rapidly grow. And usually about 4 weeks after I plant them from seed, I'm usually bumping them up to a larger container, not a huge container, usually just one size up, in order to get them even more established and growing strong in February in preparation for planting them out in the garden, usually in early March. Task number 3 is one you probably have already started on, and this is garden planning. But I mention this because a lot of us do start getting very serious about garden planning in February because March is right around the corner and April, is coming soon. So, and 2, it's still cold in a lot of places. So it's really just what we want to do to get through the winter. First, I want to speak to my current members of my Dream to Garden course. You guys have lifetime access of the course, and so I would encourage you to go back and review all the course videos and watch your email inbox for new features we are introducing this year, including an AI companion, which will help you make finding that information quicker and will help make your garden planning faster. This is a feature I've been using already in planning my garden, and it's made a huge difference. You'll get the rollout of that first. And then those of you who aren't members of Dream to Garden yet, we will be opening that up in just a couple of weeks, and you'll get full access to that as well if you become a member in February. But I do want to encourage you, those of you guys who are members to start reviewing and planning. Many of you have honestly beaten me to it. I've seen you guys in the Facebook group, but if you haven't yet, just don't forget that you have access to it and you can go back and review. And if you never finished it, you can go back and finish it. But for those of you who aren't members of Dream to Garden yet, it will open again on February 18th, but we also have a free live training coming up, and I'll share that more with you a little bit later. It's called A Productive Gardener's Blueprint, and this is going to be a free class that you won't want to miss. But until then, what I want you to do with garden planning, whether you're part of Dream to Garden or not, is make a list of what you want to grow. That's the first step that I do in my garden planning. That's the first step that I recommend you doing. To me, making a list of what I want to grow is so important to do before I even open a seed catalog. I know it takes a lot of self-control not to just jump into the seed catalog, but what can happen is that I want to grow it all because it all looks fantastic. But if I make a plan first on what I want to grow, then it helps to rein me in and helps me to really focus on the things that are most important to me. Now, once I start to decide what I want to grow and what I need, then I'll start going through seed catalogs and I'll start circling things that I might want to consider. But I always want to have in mind, what do I want to grow and what's most important to me before I start thinking about, okay, what variety do I want to grow? Or, well, maybe I want to try this before I get tempted with all the other options. So garden planning, again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that just because you hear me talk about garden planning all the time, and many of you guys have already started. But if you haven't, then this is your cue to start making a list of the things that you want to grow, because it is definitely your first step. And then make plans to attend the live Productive Gardener's Blueprint class for free, and we'll have options to join one of those classes on February 18th and 20th. Task number 4 is to, if you have a pretty day outside, prune and do some maintenance for your perennial plants that you might have in your garden. Now, if you're new here, a perennial plant is one that's going to last year after year. It's going to survive your winter. And for most of us, that's going to be fruit trees and shrubs. My perennial plants in my garden are my blueberries, blackberries, my trees like apples, peaches, and I also have asparagus. That's perennial. And some of my herbs, although I don't do a whole lot of pruning of herbs, but a lot of those are going to still be dormant in February. And for a lot of us, February is the right time to prune those. We want to prune those. Now, there's lots of different thoughts on fruit trees, and we'll get more on fruit trees later in this season of the podcast. But generally, a good rule of thumb is to prune right before the spring growth begins to start. For my blueberries in particular, I like to see a little bit of bud development on my blueberries because I can tell which canes are dead because they don't have any kind of growth, and those are easy to prune out, those for sure. But I want to do it before they're fully out because I want to get it shaped before it fills out with leaves and all of that. So this is a really good time to prune your perennials if you have them. Another thing that you can start doing is to add some fertilizer. What I like to do is, in a pretty day in February or even March, I will clean out my chicken coop from the winter, and I'll take the pine shavings / chicken manure mixture and I'll put it below my blueberry bushes. I'll put it below my fruit trees. Elderberry is another one that's a perennial, but I don't usually prune those kind of, I let go wild. But that enables me to add a little bit of a mulch, which will help with water conservation, especially when we get really heavy spring rains, but then we also get, dry conditions in the summer. But having mixed with chicken manure, it also helps to add nitrogen in a slow way to those trees. So that's something that I do every year with my fruit bushes and my trees in particular. If you do have fruit trees in particular, not necessarily like berry bushes or anything like that, this is a good time to spray a dormant oil on them before the buds form. I'm still learning about that. You can hear more information on that with my interview with Tammy from Green Thumb Nursery. We'll put that in the podcast description. And I think that's a podcast, but we also have a YouTube video with her as well that kind of shows you how to prune fruit trees. So we'll put all that in the show notes. But February in my climate is usually the ideal time to do all of that. Now, again, you can adjust that for your climate, but it may be give or take February or March or January, depending on where you're from. Before we get to the last three, I want to call your attention to two free downloads that you might be interested in. One of them is my seasonal task list. Though I'm talking about what to do in February, what you do will be based more on your season, but we're all doing the same things. We just might do them at different times. So this free download, the seasonal task list, will give you a general idea of what can be done in the winter, in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall. So grab that so you can have a checklist to help you go through and make sure you're doing what you need to do. Also, timing, plant timing. We talked about that earlier with indoor seed starting. That's really important. I've got a when to plant cheat sheet download for free for you to download as well. Both of those downloads are going to be in the description, in the show notes of this episode. So grab those when you get a chance. And then while you're there, if there's anything that I've talked about today that you want to dive more into, I told you that I would link all of that in the show notes. So check those out so you can get all the information you need for your garden. Number 5, and this will only apply to some of us, and that is we can many times start some early planting. Now, again, this is probably for most of us that have average last frost dates around early April or sooner, but here are some of the things that I'm looking to plant in February, and it's usually in late February, depending on kind of how the season's shaking out. I usually try to look at like what's the trend and what's the long range forecast and all of that. But typically it's later in February. So the first thing would be planting direct seeds of some of the colder hardy vegetables like spinach, carrots, radishes, and peas. And this would particularly be more warmer climate areas, like those with milder winters from zone 7B, I would say, to 9. This would be a good time to plant those things. I usually don't start carrots or peas until the first part of March. But like I said, if we've had a warm wave, then I might plant a little bit earlier, but usually I wait just a little bit. But if you're in an area warmer than me, then you might want to go ahead and get those in February. Another thing is to start transplanting broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale, anything like that, cool weather crops that you started indoors in late February if the weather has seemed to break, if your average last frost date, again, is March or early April. Now, what I mean by if the weather has seemed to break, with cool season crops, I'm not particularly worried about really hard killing freezes. Like today, it was like 14 degrees outside. Obviously, that's not going to work for even those cool season crops, although I have hope for my spinach, but it's established. But as far as a young plant that I'm transplanting outside, by the time late February comes here, we're not going to have those really, really cold nights typically. We will still have some freezing temperatures, but during that time of the year, late March or late February into March, sometimes we'll have long stretches of very mild weather in the 50s where the nighttime temperatures don't get lower than the 40s or the upper 30s. And sometimes we get into the 60s during the day. If my plants are ready, if I have sown them from seed indoors and they have been properly hardened off and they are ready to go in the garden, and I see a stretch of 5, 6, 7, 10 days of fairly mild temperatures without freezing nights, then a lot of times I will go ahead and plant them so they can get established in those warmer days. And if I can give them a week or so to establish in those warmer days, then if there's a late freeze, then number one, I can cover them because usually, like I said, it's not going to be like 20. But if I can get them established, a lot of times they'll do just fine because they are cool weather crops and because cool weather crops can take freezes. I don't want to plant those in the garden if it's going to be 28 that night because that would be too much of a shock, especially if I haven't hardened them off, if they hadn't gotten slowly acclimated to cool temperatures, that wouldn't be ideal. That's why watching the weather this time of year is really important to be able to make a judgment of, is this the best time to plant these crops out? But sometimes it can happen in February depending on how the weather patterns go. And of course, I'll always be prepared to use row covers if needed, if I get those things planted and then we get a late freeze or like really low temperatures. But typically that's always worked out. I don't know that I've ever lost a cool season crop in the spring by doing it this way. I probably shouldn't have said that because I probably will now, but so far I haven't yet. Task number 6 would be to focus on a compost pile if you haven't yet, because we're not super busy in February, but yet we are kind of getting the garden itch of wanting to do something. Building your compost pile or going out, like I've been piling up my kitchen scraps for 3 months, like actually turning it would probably be a good idea. Doing something with your compost to prep for spring is a really good idea in February. And as long as your compost pile isn't frozen or covered in snow, you can do this wherever you're at. And what we can do during the winter, of course, as we talked about in the winter composting episode, is continue incorporating greens and browns during the winter. And as the temperature starts to rise in the spring, that decomposition is going to get faster. One thing I like to do, usually about this time when I'm doing bed prep, is I know that at the top of my compost piles, I've got a lot of still fresh sort of kitchen scraps because they haven't broken down a lot in the winter. But at the bottom, it's pretty much compost. Over the winter, over the fall and winter, all of that has broken down. So what I will typically do is I'll take the top part of the compost and I'll take it out of my compost bin and I'll just put it aside on the ground until I reach fairly broken down compost. And then I'll scrape that out and then I'll use that to top off my raised beds or put more in the top layer of the raised bed. If I'm building a new raised bed, then that top layer of compost that still had the kitchen scraps, a lot of times I'll put that in the bottom of the raised bed just to give it extra nutrition, and then it'll compost in place. And then I'll add more finished compost toward the top. That way I'm able to use the compost in my spring as well as I can. But that is assuming that I already had a compost pile in place in the wintertime. If you haven't yet, then this would be a great time to build a compost pile or get a tumbler or however you want to do your compost. This is a great time to do it because in the next month or so, you're going to be really busy and it's going to be hard to make time to do something like that. This is a really good time to do garden projects like that. And number 7, this is probably another one that I don't necessarily have to tell you about because you're probably already doing it, is continue to work on learning, getting inspiration. This is a great time to just dream about what all is possible. I do this by going through seed catalogs. I love, honestly, probably Territorial Seed might be my favorite one to read just because it's not like it's reading an article, but it is very informative. And the seed catalogs have so much good information. You just have to sit, you kind of have to look for it. But I like getting information from the seed catalog. I also have enjoyed reading the Old Farmer's Almanac. They have some great articles in there. There are a couple of books I would recommend that I think would be helpful for you, and we'll link these. I think these are all on my Amazon shop. But one in particular is called The Seasoned Gardener by Liz Zorab. If you're watching, this is what it looks like. And I really like this because she takes you through her seasons and what she's doing each season. Now, she's in the UK, so her seasons are very different from ours. But to me, it's a nice comfort read for a gardener. And yes, you're going to get lots of like how-tos in it as well. But sometimes this time of year, I like to just read for enjoyment. So this is one that's really good. And then I also would recommend that you get 2 books by Susan Mulvihill. They are always on my shelf. They're actually here behind me because they're more of a reference book. They are the Vegetable Garden Pest Handbook and the Vegetable Garden Problem Solver Handbook, I think is what it is. But what I would recommend with those is that if you know that you have certain pests that you deal with, this book gives organic solutions for that, and you can go ahead and get started with some ideas so you're ready for those pests when they arrive in your garden. The same way with the Problem Solver Handbook. She has lots of information on diseases, and I think that's the book that she has information on wildlife, which is a problem for many of us. But that would be one that I would recommend, or those 2. And then there's another one. Oh, here's the Old Farmer's Almanac. But The Compost Coach by Kate Flood. I really liked this book for composting. So if you want to know all things composting, this would be a really good one to read as well. Those are just some reads that I would recommend that if you're wanting to get some ideas and inspiration. Of course, you've got YouTube videos and podcasts and that kind of thing, but those are some of my favorite books to read over the off season. And of course, I have lots of other ones on my Amazon shop, and we'll show you those as well. To conclude this episode, let me just give you a quick roundup of tasks. The first thing is to make sure you know your frost dates so that you know when to plant and whether you need to start some seeds indoors yet or get ready to pot up or transplant out like we talked about. Again, grab that download if you're unsure about that. Work on setting a time to start cleaning up your garden beds. If you have a nice, pretty sunny weekend day, this would be a great way to get outside and just get refreshed and ready for the season. I love doing that. Think about pruning any trees and shrubs that you need to. And then before we leave, make sure and grab any resources that you think would be helpful. The 2 downloads that I shared with you will be in the show notes, but also any of the books that I mentioned. So that will be your task list for today to start getting you inspired for your garden, especially for this February. This is, again, one of those times of year that we get so excited, and I just wanted to give you something to be able to hold on to with these tasks so that you know what you can do now to set your garden up for success this season. All right, there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this episode on your garden task, and make sure and grab all those resources, and I will chat with you again next Tuesday. Can't wait to see you then. This episode was brought to you by Organic Rev. Organic Rev is packed with over 650 strains of beneficial microbes that activate the biological activity in soil or soilless mixes. These microbes work to enhance seed germination and root development by improving nutrient availability and uptake. It's beneficial because it helps your plant become healthier and stronger and grow faster. For most applications, just mix in 1 ounce of Organic Rev to a gallon of water, and you can get a 32-ounce jug that will be equivalent to 32 gallons. Or when you're transplanting, you can mix a 50-50 mixture of Organic Rev to pack an even more powerful punch in helping your plants get established quickly. This is one of the few products that I actually use and continue using in my garden year after year. To get 10% off, go to organicrev.com and use my promo code Jill10, and I can't wait to hear what you think about it.